Autumn of 2019 settled quietly over the village of Warfield. The air was cool, the leaves had turned to shades of amber and rust, and a gentle calm held the small community in its embrace. Warfield was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, a village untouched by the hurry and noise of the outside world. Here life moved at a steady, reassuring pace. At the heart of this village was Susan Mauldin. At 65, Sue was a British retiree who had chosen this peaceful spot to enjoy her later years. With silver hair and a warm smile, she was a familiar and beloved figure, always ready with a wave or a kind word. Her days were marked by simple routines: a cup of tea in the morning sun, hours spent knitting by the fire, and afternoons in her garden, nurturing rows of flowers that brought color to her quiet street. Sue's life was built on small, cherished rituals. She was out in her garden almost every morning, pruning, watering, or simply sitting on her bench with a book in hand. And in the afternoons, she could be seen with her knitting, creating scarves, mittens, and gifts for the neighborhood children as the days grew colder. Her life was peaceful, filled with the comforts of home and nature, and her presence was a warm fixture in Warfield. But one October morning, something was different. Neighbors noticed that Sue's curtains remained drawn, and her garden gate, usually open, was firmly shut. By mid-morning, word had spread across the village that no one had seen her all day. Concern quickly turned to worry, as friends and neighbors knocked on her door, hoping she was just caught up in some forgotten task or resting. But there was no answer. Sue's house was silent, and there was no sign of her anywhere. The realization that she was missing hit the village with a force few could comprehend. This was not like Sue. She was someone of habit, a woman of routines. For her to disappear without a word was unthinkable. As evening approached, the worry deepened. Calls were made to her family, who echoed the disbelief that now gripped the village. Sue had no reason to leave, no history of illness, no plans that would explain her absence. As darkness fell over Warfield, her neighbors gathered, forming search parties, each armed with flashlights in a shared hope that they would find her soon. They searched the fields, the winding lanes, the edges of the forest where Sue liked to walk. They called her name into the still night, voices carrying their concern and desperation through the cool autumn air. But the hours passed, and there was no sign of her. The local authorities were called in, and by morning police officers arrived, questioning neighbors, combing through her routines, piecing together the last moments anyone had seen her. Yet as they gathered details of her daily life, her last known movements, and any signs that might explain her disappearance, the truth became more troubling. Sue had left no trace behind. Her home was as she'd left it, no signs of a struggle, nothing out of place. It was as if she had simply vanished. The villagers, who had once found comfort in their close-knit community, now found themselves shadowed by fear and confusion. Sue's disappearance was a mystery that none of them could explain, a disruption that tore at the fabric of their peaceful world. They clung to hope, but with each passing hour, the weight of their worry grew heavier. And so, as the days passed, Sue's absence became the question that hung over Warfield. Where had she gone? And, more hauntingly, was there something or someone responsible for her disappearance? The small village was left with a silence that felt darker and more profound than they had ever known, as they waited, desperate for answers to a mystery that had changed their lives forever. The small village of Warfield, once a peaceful haven of quiet days and gentle routines, now found itself cast into a state of unease. The disappearance of Susan Mauldin, or Sue as everyone called her, was a tragedy that had shattered the calm. The news of her vanishing had rippled through the streets, leaving behind a sense of disbelief that something so sinister could happen in their quiet corner of the world. In the days following Sue's disappearance, the village felt different, darker, quieter, as if the weight of the unknown pressed on the hearts of all who lived there. The familiar faces that once exchanged smiles and friendly greetings now wore expressions of worry and fear. Sue had been the last person anyone would have imagined in such a situation. She was the woman who knitted scarves for the children, who shared cups of tea with neighbors, who cared for her garden as if it were her own little sanctuary. But now, the village was left to reckon with the unthinkable. Where was Sue? What had happened to her? The local authorities had stepped up their efforts. Police cars could be seen parked outside Sue's house, a small army of officers combing through every room, every corner of her life, searching for anything that might explain her disappearance. The house that had once echoed with the sound of knitting needles now stood in eerie silence, with the search intensifying by the hour. They examined her garden, her belongings, and even the smallest of details, hoping that something, anything, might offer a clue. But nothing made sense. Neighbors gathered around in small groups, their faces etched with worry. In front of their homes, they exchanged theories, shared memories of Sue, and tried to hold on to the hope that this was just a temporary absence. Maybe she's gone to stay with a friend, some suggested. Others worried that perhaps she had wandered off and was lost, confused, or injured. But as the days stretched on without a trace of her, a more sinister possibility began to take root in the minds of those who knew her best. In heartfelt interviews, friends and family described the woman they had known. Her best friend, who had known Sue for over 30 years, spoke with tearful disbelief. She was a loving, kind woman. Always there for everyone, always thinking of others, she said. Sue would never just leave like this. It's not in her nature. Her son, too, described his mother as the heart of their family, a woman who would never abandon those she loved. We don't understand what happened, he said, his voice trembling. She wouldn't have just disappeared on her own. She loved her life here. But even as these emotional tributes painted a picture of a woman full of warmth and care, the investigators were beginning to suspect that this might be more than just a case of a missing person. These small signs, once overlooked, began to emerge, signs that suggested foul play. Sue's home had been meticulously searched, but no signs of struggle had been found. No indication of a forced entry or a violent confrontation, yet there were peculiarities that had begun to trouble the detectives. Her keys had been left behind. Her car was still parked in the driveway, untouched. No messages or calls had been made to her family or friends. It was as if she had simply vanished, leaving everything that had once anchored in this world behind. The police were now investigating Sue's disappearance with a heightened sense of urgency. The initial assumption of a peaceful, voluntary departure was being replaced by an uncomfortable realization someone might be responsible for what had happened to her. It wasn't just a simple case of a missing person, it was something far darker. As Warfield's community watched the investigation unfold, the fear was palpable. The village that had once been a safe, familiar place now seemed alien. Had someone in their midst been hiding a dark secret? Was there a predator among them, someone who knew Sue, or worse, someone who had been watching her for a long time? The village could no longer ignore the reality that a crime had been committed, and with it, the unsettling question, who was responsible? The warm, sunny days of autumn, once filled with the comfort of Sue's presence, now held a chill that no one could escape. And as the investigation deepened, the community of Warfield was left with more questions than answers, and the terrifying possibility that Sue's fate was far from a simple mystery. The investigation into the disappearance of Susan Mauldin had taken a dark turn. What had initially appeared to be a simple missing persons case now seemed to be entangled in a web of secrets, lies, and hidden tensions. Sue's friends and neighbors, once adamant that she was nothing but kindness and warmth, began to realize that perhaps there was more to her life than anyone had known. The quiet, peaceful woman they had all loved had lived a life that few had truly understood. As the days passed, the search for clues expanded beyond the surface. Detectives dug deeper into Sue's past, hoping to uncover any hidden conflicts, long-buried issues, or unresolved relationships that could offer a motive for her disappearance. Sue had lived a life full of routines and familiar faces, but no one could ignore the creeping suspicion that there was more at play here. Interviews with Sue's family members, her children, her siblings, revealed some surprising information. On the outside, Sue had been the perfect neighbor, a doting mother and grandmother, the kind of woman everyone admired. Yet, as the investigators began to ask more probing questions, they uncovered whispers of past struggles, unresolved family conflicts, and lingering tensions that had never fully healed. Sue's son, in particular, became a key figure in the investigation. While he spoke lovingly of his mother, there were subtle signs of strain in his words. The detectives noted that he seemed less shocked by her disappearance than one might expect. It was clear there had been disagreements in the past, things unsaid and unresolved. In a quiet interview, Sue's son admitted that they hadn't been as close in recent years, citing differences that had slowly pulled them apart. "We had our differences," he explained, his voice betraying a mix of guilt and frustration. "But I never thought anything like this would happen." His words sent ripples through the investigation. Is there more to this family dynamic than had been publicly acknowledged? Had Sue's son been hiding something, or had the tensions between them been the trigger for her disappearance? His answers, though carefully measured, felt like part of a larger puzzle, and investigators could not ignore the possibility that family conflicts played a role in Sue's vanishing. But it wasn't just her children who came under scrutiny. Sue's siblings, too, revealed glimpses of a past not as serene as it appeared. Her sister, who had spoken highly of Sue in public, admitted to a strained relationship. "We've always been different, you know," she said, nervously twisting a tissue in her hands during her interview. She was always the peacekeeper, but there were things she never shared with me. I just always thought she was happy." It was these small, almost offhand comments that made the investigators wonder. Was there something hidden in Sue's past that could explain her disappearance? Had she been carrying a secret, perhaps a secret so heavy that it could lead her to leave behind everything she loved? Then, a breakthrough came when investigators searched through Sue's home, combing through her personal belongings, hoping for some clue, some indication of where she might have gone. That's when they found a series of cryptic notes tucked away in a drawer in her bedroom. These notes, written in Sue's neat handwriting, made little sense on the surface but hinted at something darker beneath the calm facade of her life. Some of the notes contained phrases that seemed like unfinished thoughts, mysterious, incomplete ideas that hinted at unresolved issues, perhaps even threats. One note, found in an old journal, simply read, "He said I'd pay for what I did." The cryptic message sent a chill through the investigators, who began to speculate what had Sue done, and who had made such a dire statement. Other notes referenced a person Sue had been in contact with in the months leading up to her disappearance, a name that didn't immediately ring any bells. The police were puzzled. Who was this person? What role had they played in Sue's life? And could they have been involved in her sudden vanishing? As detectives continued to sift through Sue's past, the whispers of family members and those who had known her most closely began to paint a picture of a woman who, while outwardly peaceful, may have been harboring deep personal conflicts and unresolved emotional scars. Sue's seemingly perfect life was now under suspicion. Had her past, filled with unspoken tensions, hidden resentments, and perhaps dark secrets, finally caught up with her? And if so, who was responsible for the fate that had befallen her? The rumors started to swirl around Warfield. Some believed that Sue had been hiding something for years, something that had finally caught up to her. Others whispered that perhaps she had been driven to the edge by someone close to her. As the investigation began to focus on Sue's relationships and past, the community was left to wrestle with the terrifying possibility. The disappearance of Susan Mauldin was not a simple case of someone walking away, but a crime rooted in the darkness of her past. As the investigation into Susan Mauldin's disappearance entered its third week, the trail seemed to grow colder with each passing day. Despite exhaustive searches, numerous interviews, and countless hours of digging into her past, there was still no concrete evidence that could explain where she had gone. The village of Warfield, once a quiet and tight-knit community, had begun to turn on itself, each resident wondering if they could trust the people around them. The dark specter of Sue's vanishing haunted every corner. Then, as if from nowhere, an anonymous tip arrived. A phone call, cold and dispassionate, offered a clue that would soon send the entire investigation spiraling into terrifying new territory. The caller, their voice distorted, provided a cryptic location, a wooded area just outside the village, a place that Sue had frequented in the past for long walks during her solitary moments of reflection. Authorities wasted no time. They mobilized a team of investigators, search dogs, and forensic experts, racing to the site where the anonymous tip had pointed them. The woods, now ominously quiet, seemed to hold its breath as they combed through the underbrush, their every movement a step closer to uncovering the truth. It was there, nestled among the trees, that they made a discovery that would change everything. A small, blood-stained piece of Sue's clothing was found. It was a sweater, one that her neighbors recognized immediately as something Sue had worn on several occasions. The fabric was torn, as if it had been caught on something or someone. The investigators stood frozen for a moment, the gravity of the find settling over them, like a heavy fog. This wasn't just a random piece of clothing. This was a piece of Sue herself, left behind in a place that felt too intentional to be an accident. The implications were immediate and chilling. Further examination revealed traces of blood nearby staining the ground where Sue's sweater had been found. The blood, though faint, was enough to suggest that Sue hadn't left the area voluntarily. Something had happened to her, something violent. As the news of the discovery spread through the village, the atmosphere in Warfield shifted once again. What had once been a town in mourning now became a town gripped by fear. The small, peaceful community was beginning to realize that the woman they had all known and loved may not just be missing, she may have been the victim of a crime. Tensions within Sue's family and close circle of friends began to escalate. The police, now certain that foul play was involved, intensified their questioning. No one was above suspicion, not her children, not her neighbors, not her closest friends. Every detail, every conversation, every last interaction Sue had had in the days before her disappearance was examined under a harsh light. In interviews, Sue's children were visibly shaken, their faces stricken with worry and disbelief. How could their mother, a woman they had known and trusted, have ended up here, in a bloodied, isolated corner of the woods? The question gnawed at them. Was there someone in the family with a motive? Was this the tragic culmination of years of unresolved tension? Were they being suspected, despite the grief they felt? But it wasn't just family and friends who were now under intense scrutiny. The media, once a passive observer of the case, began to shift its focus onto the disturbing details that were emerging. News outlets picked up the story, sensationalizing every aspect of the case. The image of Sue, the beloved grandma of Warfield, transformed in the eyes of the public. Her image was now tied to the chilling narrative of an elderly woman who had been taken from her home, brutally attacked, and left to die in a remote, hidden spot. The media quickly coined the phrase that would haunt the headlines for weeks: the killing of Grandma. The phrase stuck, sparking outrage, sympathy, and fear in equal measure. As the media's pressure mounted, so did the intensity of the investigation. Authorities found themselves battling not only to find Sue, but also to manage the swelling public interest. Every new detail was dissected by news outlets and social media, turning the case into a public spectacle. Rumors ran rampant, theories exploded, and accusations spread like wildfire. Did someone close to Sue betray her? Was the blood-stained sweater a sign of a sudden, vicious attack? Was this the work of a family member, a secret buried too long to stay hidden? Or had a stranger crept into the village, targeting Sue for reasons no one could yet understand? The discovery of the clothing, combined with the blood traces, marked a point of no return for the investigation. The idea that this was a simple disappearance was no longer tenable. A crime had been committed, and the search for Sue had now become a hunt for answers, a hunt that was becoming ever more desperate, ever more intense, as the community of Warfield held its collective breath. But in the shadows, something darker was at play. Someone knew the truth, and it was becoming clear that the killing of Sue Mauldin was far from the simple tragedy it appeared to be. The darkness that had descended upon the village was not merely the result of a missing person, it was the result of a chilling crime that had shocked the entire community to its core. As the investigation into Susan Mauldin's disappearance plunged further into uncertainty, the hunt for answers became an intricate web of clues, theories, and revelations. The discovery of the blood-stained sweater had raised more questions than it had answered, but with each passing day, the detectives grew more determined to unravel the mystery. With the help of local authorities, they began to piece together Sue's final days, retracing her steps in the days before she vanished without a trace. Through meticulous interviews with friends, neighbors, and family, the detectives began to outline Sue's last known movements. Her once predictable, routine-driven life now appeared to be dotted with strange inconsistencies and unexplained events. She had been seen by some as she took a solitary walk in the park, just days before her disappearance, a walk that, according to witnesses, seemed different from any she had taken before. She appeared agitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be following her. But who, and why had she been so uneasy? Others recalled seeing her near the local cafe where she had an unusually tense exchange with a man, whose identity remained unclear. Sue had mentioned something about a decision she had to make, but no one had thought much of it at the time. It was a fleeting conversation, and no one could have known that it would be the last anyone would hear from her. As the detectives retraced these moments, the mounting sense that something sinister had occurred began to settle in. Sue's calm demeanor had masked an undercurrent of stress and unease. What had been going on behind the scenes? Then, the breakthrough. A new suspect emerged, a person close to Sue, someone who had been involved in her life for years, but whose presence had not been fully considered until now. This person had been one of Sue's oldest friends, a woman named Carol, who had known Sue since childhood. At first, Carol had been cooperative with the investigation, eager to help find her dear friend. But as the detectives dug deeper, they found signs that suggested Carol might have known more than she was letting on. A series of cryptic interactions between Carol and Sue began to surface. Neighbors reported overhearing heated arguments between the two women. According to one witness, Carol had been seen leaving Sue's house the morning of her disappearance. Their conversation, from what the witness could hear, seemed to be filled with tension. Sue's usually gentle voice had been sharp, demanding answers from Carol, who seemed defensive. But it wasn't just the arguments that raised suspicion. Sue's close friends revealed a striking detail. Carol had always been unusually secretive about her own finances, keeping her business dealings tightly guarded. And Sue, with her practical nature and love of simplicity, had always been open about her own money, sharing every little detail with her friends. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, she had been more closed off than usual, especially regarding her personal affairs. Had something financial been at the root of their discord? As the investigation grew more focused on Carol, shocking revelations began to emerge. Carol had a history of financial troubles, debts that were mounting, loans that were unpaid. It appeared that Sue had been helping her out, offering financial support without anyone knowing. But had that help gone too far? Was there a financial motive behind Sue's disappearance? Had Carol, desperate and possibly resentful, decided to take matters into her own hands? The detectives dug further into Carol's financial records, discovering a troubling trail. Bank statements showed large sums of money transferred to accounts that didn't seem to belong to Carol. Were these payments connected to Sue? Had she been manipulated or coerced into providing money that she couldn't afford to give? And if so, how far would Carol go to cover up her tracks? With these new findings in hand, Carol was brought in for questioning. The tension in Warfield had reached a fever pitch as news of her involvement began to leak. Neighbors who had once trusted Carol began to whisper behind closed doors. The woman they had once considered a close friend of Sue's was now at the center of the investigation. Was she responsible for Sue's disappearance? Or was there something even darker at play? Something that no one had seen coming. Carol, though visibly shaken, denied any involvement in Sue's disappearance. She insisted that the two of them had only ever been friends, that she had never caused Sue harm. She explained the tension between them as a result of personal differences, nothing more. And why had she been so adamant about keeping her financial dealings private? As the questioning continued, the detectives began to press Carol on her whereabouts during the crucial hours of Sue's disappearance. Carol's alibi, once solid, now seemed shaky. She couldn't account for her time during the period when Sue was last seen, and that raised even more alarms. The detectives felt they were closing in on the truth, but the pressure was mounting, both from within the investigation and from the ever-growing media presence. The media, having caught wind of Carol's involvement, was now running with the story. Reporters, eager for a break in the case, fed into the growing theories that Sue had been the victim of a close friend's betrayal. Headlines screamed of hidden secrets, financial betrayal, and the chilling possibility that the quiet, unassuming woman they had once trusted could have been the key to unlocking Sue's disappearance. In Warfield, the narrative had begun to shift. Was this a case of financial greed gone horribly wrong? Or was there something even more sinister behind Sue's vanishing? As the community continued to reel from the bombshells being dropped one by one, the detectives faced a critical choice. They had a suspect, yes, but did they have enough to charge her? The tension in the village was palpable, every resident now asking, what really happened to Sue Mauldin? Theories spread like wildfire. Carol, driven by desperation, had seen an opportunity to rid herself of her financial troubles. Had something more calculated been at play? The fear and suspicion that had swept through the town of Warfield was now shifting its gaze squarely onto Carol. But the question remained, did the answers lie with her? Or had a more complicated web been woven, with darker forces at work in the shadows? The search for truth had only just begun. The walls had begun to close in on Carol. The intense questioning, the pressure from both the authorities and the ever-present media was starting to take its toll. What was once a confident, composed woman now appeared fragile, unraveling with each passing moment. Her alibi had crumbled, her financial troubles exposed. And now, in the sterile, cold interrogation room, she was facing the consequences of her silence. The question that loomed over the investigation had shifted from, "Where is Sue Mauldin?" to, "What really happened that night?" Carol's responses had grown more erratic. The once confident demeanor she had maintained in front of friends and neighbors was gone, replaced with the uncomfortable shifting of someone who knew they were on the verge of being exposed. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The detectives, having spent days piecing together the evidence, began to tighten their grip on their suspect. It was as if Carol knew the truth was now an undeniable force, closing in with each passing moment. Her deflection tactics, once so skillful, had lost their effectiveness. There were no more assurances, no more simple explanations that could bury the facts. The breaking point had arrived. For hours, Carol had insisted on her innocence. She claimed she had nothing to do with Sue's disappearance. No, she loved Sue, she said. She would never hurt her. But the detectives had the evidence. The blood-stained sweater, the cryptic messages, the shaky alibi. They knew the pieces fit together too well to ignore. And so they pressed harder. The breakthrough came when the detectives took a different approach, appealing to Carol's emotions. They allowed her a brief moment of silence, just enough time to let the enormity of the situation settle in. The room was cold. the tension palpable. Carol slumped in her chair, the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. Her eyes reddened, her breath shallow, and in a moment of vulnerability, she spoke. Her voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for it to go that far," Carol said, her voice cracking as the first tear slid down her cheek. It wasn't a confession, at least not a direct one, but it was enough. Her words hit the detectives like a hammer. "I never meant for it to go that far." What did that mean? What had gone too far? Was this an admission of guilt? The room held its breath. The detective leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "What happened, Carol? Tell us what really happened." Carol looked down, her hands trembling. For a moment, she didn't answer, as though summoning the strength to confess, to reveal the horror that she had been hiding all along. And then, with a resigned sigh, she began to speak. She spoke of the financial troubles, of the mounting debt that had pushed her to the brink of desperation. She had asked Sue for help, again and again. Sue, ever generous, had given her money. She had even offered to help Carol get her life back on track. But there was more to it than that. Carol had grown resentful. The constant handouts, the constant feeling of being indebted to Sue had begun to eat away at her. She began to see Sue's kindness not as a blessing, but as a reminder of her own failures. But it wasn't just about money. It had begun to gradually shift. Something darker had been festering in Carol's mind. She had felt controlled by Sue, not just financially, but in every way. Sue's quiet confidence, her ability to remain composed no matter the circumstances, had begun to feel suffocating to Carol. And then, one night, things had gone too far. Carol had gone to Sue's house, as she often did, but that evening was different. Sue had been upset, more than usual. She had confronted Carol about her spending, her refusal to take responsibility for her own life. The conversation had quickly escalated, and before Carol knew it, words turned into actions. The details Carol gave were chilling, but not yet complete. She described how she had shoved Sue during their argument, knocking her off balance. Sue, still upset but trying to stand her ground, had stumbled and hit her head. Carol panicked, not knowing what to do. She had tried to help Sue, but the fear of what had just happened gripped her. What if Sue never forgave her? What if the whole town found out? In that moment, Carol made a terrible decision. She tried to cover up the incident, moving Sue's body, concealing the evidence. The panic that had set in clouded her judgment. What began as an argument between friends had spiraled into something far worse, a life lost, a crime committed in the heat of anger and fear. She had never intended for it to go that far, but it had. The detectives were silent, letting Carol's words sink in. There was no more denying it, they had their confession. But even as Carol spoke, more questions lingered. How had Sue's body ended up where it did? What had really happened in those final moments? And how far would Carol go to keep her dark secret buried? As Carol's emotional breakdown continued, the detectives received confirmation from forensic teams, the evidence they had been waiting for. A piece of Sue's clothing found miles away from her home had been traced to Carol. Blood samples from the scene matched Sue's DNA. The chilling truth was now undeniable. Sue Mauldin had been murdered, and Carol was responsible. The investigation, which had begun as a simple missing person case, had now become a full-fledged murder investigation. The peaceful village of Warfield was forever altered. The sense of safety that had once enveloped the community had been shattered, replaced by a haunting reality. One of their own had been capable of such a heinous act. The public, once supportive of Carol, now looked upon her with suspicion. The small town that had once thrived on trust and familiarity now felt foreign, unsafe. And yet, as the detectives prepared to take Carol into custody, the nightmare was far from over. More revelations awaited. Carol's confession was only the beginning of a tangled web of lies, betrayals, and hidden truths. The real horror was just beginning to emerge, and the shocking revelations of what had led to Sue's death would continue to haunt the town for years to come. The truth, once buried in the shadows, had finally been dragged into the harsh light of day. The community of Warfield, where the Mauldin family had lived for so many years, was now torn between grief and a sense of relief. The murder of Susan Mauldin had shaken the very core of this tight-knit village. The idyllic streets, once filled with the comforting sounds of neighborhood life, now echoed with the somber tones of a town forever changed. When Carol was arrested and charged with Sue's murder, the community was thrown into a state of collective disbelief. The same woman who had once been a friend, a confidant, was now the one responsible for taking the life of someone they all adored. The story that had once been about a missing person had now morphed into a shocking tale of betrayal, lies, and violence. The truth was too much to process, too painful to accept. Sue, the woman everyone had known for her kindness, her gentle heart, had been taken from them in the most brutal of ways, by someone who had once called her family. For Sue's family, the grief was overwhelming. Her children, who had fought to understand what had happened to their mother, were left to grapple with the horrifying reality of her death. They mourned not just the loss of their mother, but the woman they thought they knew. There was no comfort in the fact that the truth had come to light. The betrayal was still too raw, the damage too deep. There would be no healing for them without time, and even then, the scars would linger. The trial, when it came, was a spectacle. The once quiet community was now under the glare of the media, who descended like vultures, hungry for every detail of the twisted story. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Carol, sitting there in the defendant's seat, appeared a shadow of her former self. The confident woman who had once walked among them now seemed small, broken. Her guilt was undeniable, and as the prosecution laid out the evidence, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Carol had taken Sue's life. The case that had rocked Warfield was now coming to its conclusion. Carol was found guilty of murder. The judge handed down a sentence that left little room for mercy, life in prison. For many, the conviction brought some sense of justice, but it did little to heal the wounds that had been left behind. The town, still reeling from the discovery of the crime, now had to face the reality of their own brokenness. A woman they had trusted had killed someone they loved. How could they ever go back to the way things were? Was it possible to ever feel safe again? As the months passed and the dust began to settle, reflections poured in from all corners of the community. Neighbors, family, and friends shared their thoughts on Sue's life and the impact of her death. Sue had been the heartbeat of the community, the woman who always knew how to listen, how to offer comfort, and how to bring people together. Her death had left a hole that no one could fill. But it wasn't just about the lives she had lost. It was about the lives of those she had touched. Everyone who had known Sue had been forced to confront their own humanity. How could they have missed the signs? How could they have not seen the growing tension between Carol and Sue? Sue's death had forced them to question the relationships they took for granted, to look deeper at the people around them, and to understand the darkness that can lie hidden just beneath the surface of even the most familiar faces. The detectives who had worked the case, who had sifted through the layers of lies and deceit, also found themselves forever changed. They too had known Carol. They had seen her in town, exchanged pleasantries with her, never suspecting the depths of her resentment or the extent to which her emotions had been driven by desperation. The case had shattered their own sense of security, reminding them that the truth, no matter how carefully concealed, always finds its way to the surface. For these men and women, this was not just another case. It was a reminder of the human capacity for both good and evil, and how thin the line between them could be. In the aftermath of the trial, the community attempted to rebuild. Some turned to faith, others to therapy, but all struggled with the same question: how do we move on from something so tragic? How could they find peace in a town where peace had been shattered so violently? They leaned on one another. They came together in ways they never had before, determined to honor Sue's memory and to rebuild the trust that had been lost. They planted flowers in her honor, started charities, and made sure her name was remembered in the best ways possible. But no matter how much they tried to heal, Sue's death had left a permanent mark. It had exposed the fragility of the life they had once known, the fleeting nature of trust, and the painful truth that evil sometimes lives just around the corner, even in the most familiar places. As time passed, the community would find its rhythm again, But the scars would never fade. For Carol, the trial was only the beginning of her own personal reckoning. Behind bars, she would have to face the reality of her actions, of the woman she had killed, the family she had destroyed, and the future she had stolen from herself. The whispers of her past, her debts, her frustrations, her hidden resentments, would haunt her every day. She would live with the knowledge that she had taken a life, that she had betrayed the very people who had once cared for her. And for Sue, her story had been one of quiet grace, of generosity, of selflessness. Her life had been tragically short, but the ripple effects of her death would continue to resonate, not just in Warfield, but in the hearts of everyone who had known her. In the end, Sue Mauldin was more than just a victim. She was a symbol of the strength of love, of kindness, and of how easily those things can be taken for granted. And in the shadow of her loss, the community was forced to reflect on the value of life, the importance of relationships, and the ever-present darkness that lurks behind closed doors. The killing of Grandma, as the media had dubbed it, was over. But for everyone involved, the story would continue to unfold for years to come. And though the truth had been uncovered, it had come at a cost too great to measure.